The Intermodal Association of North America developed a session for its 2012 Intermodal Operations and Maintenance Seminar that focused on the components of a pre-trip inspection based on the current federal motor carrier safety regulations. This video is an abbreviated version of that session and visually illustrates the procedural steps to be followed by a driver prior to taking an intermodal chassis on the road. Because of space limitations during the session, only the front, left side, and rear of the chassis and container were inspected. During an actual inspection, duplicate right side items would also be inspected.
And typically with the inspection, we'll start at the front bolster, and we try to do a natural flow, starting at the front of the equipment, working our way down the driver's side, across the back. So this tire shows a cold temperature of 105 pounds. So we're gonna check and make sure that we're within about a 20% range of that.
I'm at 105.
All right, so we're at 105, we'll check the back tire as well.
And while I'm down here, I'm also looking at the identification. The identification should be on all four sides of the chassis, therefore I'm looking to make sure it's still the same.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second of the concurrent sessions on intermodal equipment inspections. Our first part of the program will focus on pre-trip inspections by a driver of a container chassis. He'll also talk a little bit about what he does with his tractor. First off, my name is Paul Tamborelli. I'm Vice President of Government Relations for Checkmark Vehicle Safety Services. Started in spring of 2008 by the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. CVSA is the association that represents the state police and highway patrol agencies throughout North America that conduct commercial vehicle enforcement inspections. And we also are the keepers of and the developer of the North American Out of Service criteria. You should have all received 3 handouts today when you came in. If not, please make sure you get them before you leave. The first handout is the changes in the out of service criteria that went into effect on April 1st of 2012. If you'll notice, and for those of you that get the out of service criteria, you notice that there's a nice letter with it. If you've never seen it and or you have an old edition, let this be a catalyst for you to order a new one in March of each year because, again, it's a living, breathing document. It changes. There's 12 additions that were added to the out-of-service criteria. The second 2 pages that you were given came actually from sessions that we've done over the last couple of years. These are actually inspectional bulletins that are sent to all the state police and highway patrol agencies throughout the United States that do commercial vehicle enforcement. The first one has to do with marking of equipment, the requirements for marking of equipment. Just for a point of information, this was sent out to all the troopers, all the officers, and highway patrolmen that do inspections so they understand the gear program. And yes, we do know there are still some tickets being written for units that are in the gear program. Unfortunately, our recommendation is if you make this, a copy of this and get this out to your truckers, it gives them something to show the officers, and the officers can tell the roadside officer that the equipment they're pulling is a part of the gear program. The second one is a securement issue that was brought to us on intermodal chassis, and I want to thank Jim Rio, if he's in the room, for helping us put this one together. There's been an issue about load securement of a box on a chassis if one of the corner locks was defective. As you know, for defective corner locks, just 1 out of 4 locks, the unit's placed out of service. What this program, or what this inspectional bulletin tells the roadside officer, and again, this was also sent out to the roadside officer, is that there's an alternate means are allowed to attach the box to the chassis to get it to its point of destination. So again, both of these were done with the help of IANA, and we want to thank you for your participation with that. I'd like to start off our program by introducing our 2 presenters, both with the Schneider National Intermodal. Our first presenter is Dan Dorella. Dan is the Director of Intermodal Equipment and Maintenance. He's worked with Schneider National Intermodal for the past 14 years in finance and risk management departments. For the last 4 years, he's been responsible for the equipment maintenance and repair issues, including accountability for equipment, specs for trailers and containers. Now, have you ever seen a container chassis this clean? We wanted to, when it came in here yesterday and we saw it, we actually wanted to throw a little dirt on it. So we thank you, Dan. And then our driver today is an actual driver for Schneider. In fact, he's been with the company for 2 years. He has 19 years of driving experience, and last year, only in his second year with Schneider, he was named their Driver of the Year, Driver of the Quarter, and Driver of the Year for 2011. So congratulations. His name is Robert Chiish, and we appreciate your being here. And with that, Dan and Robert, the show's yours.
And typically with the inspection, we'll start at the front bolster, and we try to do a natural flow, starting at the front of the equipment, working our way down the driver's side, across the back, and then back up the passenger side of the right side of the piece of equipment, finishing again back where we started. First thing we'll look at is the FMCSA, or formerly FHWA inspection. If you're in California, the bid inspection. We're going to look and make sure that that's a valid sticker. So this unit was inspected, last certified 4 of 12, so we're good for another 12 months, so we know we're good there. One of the things we do, we start there, because if that's expired, we know we're going to have to get that chassis, the container flipped to another chassis, so there's no sense in going through and pre-trip and the rest, because that chassis is going back to maintenance. The next thing Robert will do is he'll look at the 7-way plug, our electrical connection. He'll make sure that we've got a good plug there, we've got a good lid with a spring. We'll check the pins, make sure all of our pins are solid, so we can make a good connection. We'll actually make our electrical connection, because what we want to do is we want to test our lights as we go. We're going to be looking at our lights and make sure they're all operable. The next thing we'll do is we'll look at the glad hands. And the glad hands, a couple of different things we're looking for. We want to make sure they're solid. They're solidly mounted. They're not flopping. We don't have any apparent problems with the airlines connected to the glad hands. Look at the grommets. We make sure the grommets are in good shape. They're not worn, cut, torn, abraded, and so forth. So we can get a good air seal so our brakes are going to work properly. And once we check that, then we'll also connect our brake lines, which will help us with our pump down test that we're going to do a little bit before we go. One of the things we're also going to take note of on the front is this is a hazmat load. Now, we've looked at our bills, we understand what our hazmat product is, and we're looking at our placards. So we've got a corrosive placard on the front, and now we're going to watch that as we go around and make sure that matches with what else we see on the rest of the way around the trip. The next thing Robert's going to do is going to look at the front locking pin. He's going to operate that locking pin, make sure everything works smoothly. He's going to make sure that latch is there as well so we can get a positive lock. As we're doing that, we're also going to look in and make sure that the pin is in place, that it hasn't been sheared off during loading, and that we've got a positive lock into the box, so we're safe and secure on the front end. So on the front end, we've got our front corner marker light. We've also got the conspicuity tape on the side. And the next thing, Robert, if you want to then take over and tell us about what you're looking for down at the fifth wheel.
All right, right now for the fifth wheel, I'm looking to make sure my fifth wheel locking handle is in place and is locked in. I also check to make sure that my locking wedge or jaws are also locked. So by doing that, I take a flashlight and I look at the kingpin, and also making sure while I'm down here that actually the fifth wheel and the fifth wheel upper coupling plate, it lays flat solid.
Robert, normally, as you're doing your pre-trip inspection, typically, for the demonstration purposes, we're coupled, but
Right.
typically, before you couple onto the unit, you do some inspections on the coupler on the kingpin.
Correct. I look at the kingpin to make sure it's not bent or damaged, and I also look at the upper coupler plate, make sure that's not damaged or warped.
All right. So we've looked at the front bolster, we've looked at the upper coupler and the kingpin, some of the FMCSA roadability defect items, and now we'll start to work our way further back.
Well, right now on the post, I'm looking for the IBC, the inner box connectors. I'm making sure they are not still connected onto the box.
Once in a while, one of the problems we run into, if an inner box connector gets twisted during the loading or unloading operation, it'll get hung up, it'll get lifted off the train, but an IBC could get hung up here or in the upper position as well. By stepping back, you can see daylight through, and you can make sure that you're clear here so you won't end up dropping on the road and potentially have an incident there.
From that point, now I go and I'm checking out my landing gear. But before I check my landing gear, since I'm down, I'm also looking at my identification plate. The identification plate is present, and also so is The registration and the inspection ticket is there too as well.
So we're going to make sure that both of those documents are present. Now we know that our FMCSA sticker on the front was dated for 4/12, so we want to make sure that the paperwork coincides with that.
That's correct, and also you want to make sure it's also the same chassis too.
All right,
That chassis is correct.
All right, so we verified the chassis number and we verified the inspection date corresponds with what we see on the FMCSA sticker on the front. And then we'll also make sure that the registration document is here, and we'll need to verify the unit number on the registration document as well. We're going to look at the landing leg. We're going to make sure all the bolts are on the landing leg. They all look solid. There's no cracks in the welds on the gussets and the supports. We're going to look at the leg itself and make sure everything is intact. The sand shoe is intact. We're going to look at the spreader bar underneath, and that's good and solid. We're going to check the cross shaft that drives the other leg and make sure that that's bolted in place. Make sure we've got a handle. The handle's properly secured, properly in the holder. And then we're also going to make sure that the timing works. If it's a low-speed, high-speed landing leg, we can operate that and make sure that those functions are working so that if we've got a load and we need to operate the landing legs, that we can do that without injury to the driver. All right. And you're also going to sight down the frame rail and look at your cross members?
Right, so at this point, now that we've covered the landing gear, now I'm going to look at the chassis rail, make sure that's straight, make sure there's no damage. Also, with the inconspicuity tape is also present. And I'm also looking at my cargo, make sure that it's not leaking. Make sure all the cross members are intact and tight in place.
All right. So then we'll move back to the middle of the body of the chassis. We make sure we've got our placard here in place. That matches our placard on the front for corrosive material. It matches our bills. And then we'll look at the middle of the frame of the chassis.
It also has, and there you will also see a marker light. And while I'm down here, I'm also looking at the identification. The identification should be on all four sides of the chassis. Therefore, I'm looking to make sure it's still the same. While I'm down here, I'm also looking for cross members of the chassis themselves, make sure they're not damaged. I'm also looking at the electrical and the air lines going from the front of the chassis to the back and make sure that they're not frayed or broken or cracked.
So now at this point, we'll move toward the rear of the chassis and we'll look at the running gear on the back.
Yes.
As we get to the running gear, a lot of business going on back here. Typically, we can sight a lot of these things from the outside edge. For sake of be able to show you some of the components, Robert's going to go a little further on to be able to point to some of the components and explain some of the things we're looking at. And we'll typically start out with the slider system. So again, another one of the FMCSA components. We're going to look at the slider. We're going to make sure we've got a pin on this side, and we'll look at the same on the other when we get there. We're looking at the slider handle to make sure that that's in place and operable. And then we'll start to look at the brake components. Now, our drivers will typically carry a go, no-go gauge, so we know that we need to have at least a 1/4 inch of brake lining. So Robert has a gauge that tells him his 1/4 inch specification. He'll check he'll check the brakes on this side, and he'll look at the brakes on the other side as well. Make sure we get that 1/4 inch of lining. We're looking for any kind of cracks, whether along the length of the shoe or through the shoe, to make sure that there's no problems. This one appeared to have about 3/4 of an inch of brake lining, so we're in good shape in that respect on this unit. While we're down there, we're also looking at the suspension components. And what are the things you look for in the suspension, Robert?
I make sure that the brackets are in place and intact and tight. I also look at the spring itself, make sure it's not cracked or broken. Also the U-bolts and the nuts, and also the spacer. Make sure all that's tight and make sure there's no spacing. And one way you can tell is by shiny. If it's loose, it'll rub back and forth and you can see it'll start having a shine to it. I'm looking at the radial arm and also the torque arms and make sure those are tight. And also we're looking at the brake chambers, make sure they're tight, make sure that the air line's coming in, that they have to make sure that the fittings are not loose.
We'll look at our push rods. In this example, we have a chassis that has underslung brake chambers, so in the stacking operation, you have the risk of damage to the push rods from being stacked on top of another chassis. So you guys want to look for any kind of bent push rod that would prevent proper operation, that would disable the brake on an axle, so that's a critical component. And then looking at our slack adjusters, which we'll actually look at from between the axles. So then we get outside to the tires. And with the tires, there's a lot of different things we're looking for. We'll start at the hub itself.
Okay, I'm looking at the lug nuts, make sure that they're secured, make sure that they're there. Also the wedges, make sure that they're there. And also the spacer, make sure there's no damage to the spacer as well.
There are some telltale signs of a possible problem. Can you tell me what some of those?
Sure. One telltale sign on the spacers, it'll be cracked. And on the wedges, you'll see some wearing, you'll see some rubbing on each side of it if they become loose.
Another sign that we look for, typically inflation valves will be centered between the spokes, and so we'll look for that to be centered up on both those as well. If that's off center, that could mean that it's loose and it's slid as well, right? We're gonna look at the hub itself.
Right, we're also looking for any signs of the seal leaking, and one sign is as, obviously you can see the grease or gear oil would be surrounding it.
All right, so then we're gonna start looking at the tires, and one thing we're gonna do is check inflation on the tires. So this tire shows a cold temperature of 105 pounds, so we're gonna check and make sure that we're within about a 20% range of that.
I'm at 105.
All right, so we're at 105, we'll check the back tire as well.
105.
All right, so we got 105 and 105, so we're good to go on that. Again, we use about a 20% range. Below 20%, we consider that flat. Ask to have it taken off and broken down, inspected to see what the problem is. We're gonna look at that tire. We've got, we call it ABCs that we're looking for in the tire.
Right, we're looking for abrasions, bulges, cuts, and also cap separation. So make sure we don't have any of that. And also we're looking at the tread depth.
So you got your go, no-go gauge
I got
you
my
use
go
again here.
Correct. The minimum is 230 seconds. I also have that, and I check it in 3 different spots on the two main treads.
2 main grooves.
Right.
So we're going to check all the tires with that same gauge and that same criteria that has to be 230 seconds or greater, 230 seconds at a bare minimum. We're going to look at that tread face overall. We're going to look for things like nails and bolts. We're going to look for slid flat spots.
Dry rot.
Dry rot, channel cracking, all those sorts of things we're going to get into and make sure that that tire looks good before we pull it off the facility. We're going to look in between the tires and look for any sign of debris that might have gotten caught between the duals as well.
That is correct. And also, I'm also looking at my equalizer bracket, making sure that's tight and make sure that's secured.
From this point, we also have a view of the push rods on the brakes on the front axle, and we can also see the slack adjuster from this side. It's hard to see from the front with the underslung, but if you're careful and you watch, now you can see, get a nice view of those underneath as well. So we're going to go back and we're going to do the same with the second axle. We're going to check our air pressure. We're going to inspect the tread face, inspect the side for any signs of damage. We're going to look between the duals. We're going to look at that hub again. We're looking at each of the wedges again, looking at the lugs. Everything looks okay. We've got another stack frame here. So again, like we set up at the front, we're going to look for that inner box connector. On the bottom, we're going to take that step back. We're going to look at the top and make sure everything looks clear. We don't see a connector there, so that one looks clear. And now we're going to look at the suspension on the rear.
That's correct. Now we're looking at the rear brackets, but as well as I'm walking up, I can also see the mud flap brackets, make sure that they're mounted, make sure that they're solid, and make sure that I have mud flaps. And also, now from here, I can also see
Looking at your brake chambers.
and I can also see the slack adjusters. And the slack adjusters should not be more than 90 degrees. 90 degrees or larger or greater, then they have to get serviced.
Now, from this angle also, you've got a great view looking forward again up that main rail to make sure that everything looks like it's hasn't been damaged during an accident or stacking or something of that nature as well. Now we're going to look up underneath. We're going to make sure those clips are in place for the slider subframe.
Yep.
So we have that slider subframe loose. Those both appear to be in place, locked in well there. Looking at the leaf springs looking forward, and then we're also looking at that slider subframe for integrity. So from here we can look forward, we can make sure that that frame is intact and everything looks good there. So, we're pretty well through the running gear. And we'll continue to work our way back then.
On the rear of the chassis, we're going to look at the rear underrider guard. That's not any kind of bent 3-inch of any direction.
So we're looking for a 3-inch deflection, up, down, forward, back.
We're also checking our marker lights, our incapacity tape, also our turn signals, our lights, and then we'll check our brake lights.
All right, we'll make sure we have license tag back there. The tag light is working as well. What are the things you're going to look for on the box on the back of the equipment?
Well, with this being corrosive, I would look for seal, and I would also make sure that the locking bars are in.
All right, we've also got the ABS light here. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, on this one, which this particular truck has what they call a pre-trip button, it will cycle through all the lights. So if I push the button in, I can cycle through all the lights. Most of the time with some chassis, all they do is, during a pump down, when I initially do a pump down, the light will come on as I do it. So if you press on the brakes, this light should come on.
So the last thing on this corner is we're going to look at the twist lock. We're going to operate the twist lock. We're going to look at the head of the twist lock inside the container and make sure it's locking in securely.
To see if it's completely locked down onto the chassis, it will be in a T position.
So then we continue again over to the right-hand side of the vehicle. Twist lock on the other corner, start running up the running gear on the other side, and just basically complete the same process in reverse, working our way up until we get back to that FMCSA, kind of back to home base at the FMCSA sticker in the front of the unit. And so that's our full trip around.